The Mongols are historically most famous for conquering all of this, from humble beginnings on the steppe to their conquests of places like the Kievan Rus in Eastern Europe, the Khwarezmian Empire in the Middle East, and most notably the Jin and Song dynasties in China. Now obviously they couldn't subjugate everything. In the history of the Mongol Empire is filled with places that they simply couldn't beat, and one of the most notable examples is that of Japan, which sat just off the coast of the core of Mongol wealth and power, the Great Empire of China, the Yuan dynasty. This dynasty was established by a certain Kublai Khan, who was himself a very capable general and leader. And yet, even this, combined with the incredible wealth of manpower that ruling China gave him, Kublai was never able to conquer Japan despite 2 attempts, and after this no other ruler of China would ever make an attempt to do so again. Which raises a pretty obvious question. Why couldn't the Mongols conquer Japan? Why was such a large and militarily capable empire not able to crush his much smaller neighbor? So to backtrack a bit, when the Khagan, that is the emperor of the Mongol Empire, Mongol Khan, died from a medical condition known as being shot with an arrow in 1259, rulership of the empire went to his younger brother Kublai, who was seen by some Mongol nobles as being far too Chinese in his habits. As such, they wanted his younger brother Arik to rule instead. Now, when a ruler was challenged, the Mongols had a long history of settling this with recent debate, by which I mean brutal and bloody civil war. This ended with the Arik surrendering and the Mongol Empire fracturing, with Kublai remaining as the titular ruler of the empire, but in fact he was just a notional figurehead and the Great Mongol Empire was really no more. Kublai would go on to prove his opponents wrong and would not only subjugate Korea but would also go on to crush the remainder of the Song dynasty in the south, which would then cement the new Chinese dynasty that he had founded. Now it won't shock you to know that a man like Kublai wasn't exactly satisfied with all that he had, and so it was obviously time to conquer more. And whilst he was finishing off the Song and deciding where to go next, Kublai was sure to establish diplomatic relations with the Japanese government next door. This government was the Kamakura shogunate, and as you'll likely know from much of its history, Japan's emperors were simply a puppet of the shogun. However, at this time the shogun was also a puppet under the shikin, that is, the regent, which was occupied by a man called Hojo Tokimune, who had just gotten the job when Kublai's messengers turned up. The message they carried was simple: "You're our vassal, so pay us tribute or we'll hurt you." His response was that he didn't respond and just sent them back to China. This didn't go down well with Kublai, who now had an excuse to invade. Now those of you with a keen knowledge of military strategy will know that the Mongol method of mounted warfare wasn't very applicable at sea, and so Kublai had to build an armada to carry his army to Japan and potentially defeat any naval or coastal defenses on the way. And for this he turned to the Koreans, who had a long history of shipbuilding and naval warfare, and also they couldn't say no. So Kublai figured that a naval invasion of a highly militarized island would be easy enough, and by 1274 the fleet was ready to go, and so off they went. The Mongols, or more accurately the Mongol-led Yuan Chinese and Korean army, quickly captured the island of Tsushima before landing in Japan proper. Kublai of course couldn't go himself because he and the bulk of his army were still trying to secure the Mongol grip from China, but he wished them well. Anyway, upon landing in Japan, the Yuan had to fight and establish a beachhead. And during this initial skirmish, the samurai defending Japan did very poorly. Now there's a common misconception that this was due to the samurai tradition of dueling, and that in battle they would challenge individual Yuan soldiers or leaders to honorable combat, only to then get shot in the face. The actual reason that they struggled was that whilst gunpowder weaponry wasn't entirely new to Japan, it wasn't something commonly used in warfare there. And so when the massed ranks of Yuan soldiers fired volleys of hand cannons into the Japanese line, they had no idea how to respond, which meant that it was just easier to run away and resort to hit-and-run tactics. The Yuan army pushed forwards, but it didn't take long for its leaders to realize that they didn't have the resources to actually conquer the place. And also, the sailors that had taken them there warned them of an impending storm, which, if they remained, could strand them on Japan. And so, before any real damage could be done, the Yuan retreated and sailed away, and promptly into aforementioned storm, which drowned a third of them. So attempt number 1 hadn't gone too well, and Kublai wanted revenge. His main priority was that he still had to finish off subjugating the rest of China. But as this was going on, he ordered his advisors to plan a much grander invasion to punish those who had resisted him. And the Khagan, because he was just so nice, sent more emissaries to Japan to give them yet another chance to pay him tribute. However, unlike the last time, these envoys were ordered not to return from Japan until they got an answer. And so Tokimune, realizing that he couldn't get rid of them, agreed to meet Kublai's representatives in the capital, where they were promptly beheaded. Because as far as the Shikin was concerned, he had just defeated them, so why would he pay them tribute? I mean, he wouldn't even listen to his own emperor, let alone someone else's. Now, the Japanese didn't know it, but they were now a part of a noble history of states killing Mongol envoys, and like the other times, there would be consequences. And the shogunate was quick to start preparations for the inevitable round 2. The government ordered the building of coastal fortifications to make landing even harder, as well as forming militias to increase the number of soldiers available to repel an invasion. The Kamakura government also began preparations for an invasion of Korea. The Shikan's hope was that they would simply be able to conquer it swiftly and thus deprive the Mongols of a staging ground for any further expeditions. And if not, the plan was that they'd at least be able to seize these islands off of Korea's coast, which would then be apportioned out to those who had just defeated the Mongols. This plan was dropped after a couple of months because 1. The Kamakura shogunate wasn't exactly the most stable government, and its leaders were concerned that many of their nominal vassals would simply rebel. And 2. The number of men required for such an overseas invasion meant that the previously announced coastal walls would take much longer to build, which the Shikan saw as a priority. And in 1281 the Yuan army returned, but this time it was a much larger force. Sources from the time claimed that the invasion numbered about 135,000 to 150,000 men sailing to Japan. However, if you know anything about medieval and classical historians and their approach to reporting on numbers involved in wars, they have a tendency towards exaggeration. But either way, this force was almost certainly many times larger than the last one. Kublai planned for a smaller first fleet to leave Korea and take these islands here, which would give the main fleet departing from China somewhere to assemble before launching the invasion of the Japanese mainland. That was the theory, but when the first fleet arrived in Japan and took the Tsushima or Nikki Islands again, its leaders decided that they would need a small detachment of their own to secure a footing before the Japanese could react. They briefly established a small beachhead here, but the Japanese fortifications and fierce resistance meant that they couldn't advance. The remnants retreated to Hirashikanoshima Island, and a raiding by samurai forced them to yet again retreat back to Iki Island, where, as planned, they would await the arrival of the main force. Slight problem though, the plan had changed. Yuan military leaders worried that landing in the same place as the first invasion was stupid, and so they decided to land here on Hirado Island, which they were able to take with relative ease. The main force then sent 2 small detachments to the north, one to tell the first force where to meet them, and the second to take the island of Takashima as a midway point between the two. Yet more samurai raiding meant that the first force were more than happy to depart, and they quickly abandoned Iki Island. They joined up with the main force, and after some skirmishes, Yuan leaders were preparing for the long march up through Japan. However, this would have to be delayed because of a famous typhoon, Kamikaze, the divine wind. This wrecked the overwhelming majority of the Yuan fleet and stranded the army, but that was okay because the leaders of the expedition had a plan that would fix everything. But before they could put it into action, they quickly just had to go and see this thing, but don't worry about it. They're not coming back. So, with the army abandoned, it wasn't long before the Japanese attacked and finished off the rest of it. And whilst it goes without saying that the typhoon was disastrous for the Mongol design on Japan, it's important to note that even without them, the Japanese were more than capable of repelling the invaders at a high cost to themselves. And whilst it's impossible to know how things would have gone without the Kamikaze, we do know that the Yuan would have struggled to supply such a large army the further they advanced into Japan. And we also know that the vast majority of the shogunate's forces were still waiting and ready to fight. Back in China, and undeterred by 2 catastrophes, Kublai immediately began to set in motion a third invasion, and it was at this point that basically everyone advised him not to do so. The last 2 had obviously been terrible for everyone involved, and at this point there were now rebellions across China, and so taking tens of thousands of soldiers and moving them away would only serve to undermine his rule. Kublai begrudgingly agreed and spent the rest of his reign invading Burma, which went pretty well as Vietnam and Java, which very much did not. Now, after Kublai's death, the Mongols remained in charge of China until the Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming, and no emperor after Kublai gave any real thought to conquering Japan. Much of this was because the Yuan emperor struggled with maintaining stability in China, and so their resources were stretched already. And the Ming, whilst maintaining that the Japanese were rightfully their vassals, were often reminded of Kublai's failures whenever they tried to get involved in Japan's internal affairs. For example, when Japan had a dynastic dispute between 2 different emperors, the Ming interfered and gave its support to one claimant, simply demanding that the other submit immediately. But the shogun, who was now back in charge, told him to bat out and made it clear that China wasn't capable of doing anything about it anyway. And so for the Ming, it was better to just focus on trade and being amicable. That was, of course, until Japan launched their own invasion of Korea in the late 16th century, and relations between the two got really bad again, but that's a whole other episode.